Hi there, Darren at ProtoPie here, and today we're going to get into the world of components, and we're going to build a text field input component, so that we can reuse that, create forms and logins and things like that. So this is our first look into components, so there's a few different things that we need to kind of go through, which is very specific to components, but I'm going to start from scratch. I've just got a brand new Pi file open, and we'll just use the iPhone 11 Pro, but you can use whatever you want. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to draw the input text field, and we're going to do it all inside of ProtoPie. We're not going to import any graphics for this one. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab an input. Okay, and we're going to create a label. Let's just call this input. Call this label. So this is kind of going to be based on the material design, the Android material design input field. And we're just going to type label in there. And we're just going to go into this text field, and we're going to remove the hint text. There it is. Oops. Okay, and we're going to put our label inside, or effectively it's overlaying the text field. Just going to style this a bit. $16 is fine, let's make it a bit heavier. Okay. That text color, the color should be fine. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Okay, so we're going to create a background. I'm just going to put that underneath. I'm going to make it input shaped. Let's make it 56 high and make it 343 wide. Let's go and move this over here. Okay. And we're going to remove the background color of the input itself. So let's just set that fill down to 0. And we're going to get rid of the border as well. Excuse me. And let's just grab these two, kind of center them sort of. Okay, I want another rectangle. I want to create the line that kind of activates, shows that the input's selected. I'm just going to make that 2 pixels high. Let's move that kind of at the bottom, make that 343 as well, and let's just give it a color so we can see it. Okay, so that's our kind of selected line. Let's call that activated line, and we're going to move that just above the background. That looks pretty good. Okay, so we've got our kind of basic input. So we're going to select all of those things. We're going to make that a component. Okay, so you can see instantly that all of our layers have now been merged into this component 1.1. And you'll also see, let's go inside these. So you'll see it's created a component under the local components, which is the components which are inside of this particular pie file. Let's just call that input. Text input. Okay, so we're gonna double click this, and now we're inside of the component. So we've got inside, when you go inside of a component, you've got your own triggers panel, you've got your own, let's just hide this for a second, you've got your own variables panel. So this variable, any variables in this panel are only accessible inside of your component. So this is all kind of self-contained, and you can see that the root of layers now has got this kind of teal color, and it's got the component icon here, and you can see all of our layers that we created has now been nested inside of the component. Okay, so that's good. So now we need to start to add some interactions. So the first thing we're going to do is, well, let's talk about this for a minute. So I want to be able to tap on the input, and I want it to be able to become active. I want to be able to tap outside of the input and for it to become inactive. I also want the ability to focus the input by default, so I want that control. So, and then we need to also, the text that you type into the input, we need to get that out of the component so we can access it outside in our prototype as well. So first things we're going to do is we're going to create the focus state. So that's add focus. So under input, we've got a focus trigger, and it's going to ask us what we want to focus. So we want to focus our input. So you can only focus input. So you'll see here, it only shows the input because I've only got one text input in my component, so that's fine. And you can see here, I can choose to focus in or focus out. So for this one, I want to focus in. Let's just put focus in, make it really clear. Let's just look at our label. It's going to change the positioning a little bit. Let's make this the same as well. 16 and 20. Okay, so if you're familiar with the material design text input, what actually happens is the label for the text field is inside of the text field. When you tap on the text field, it kind of animates up into the top of the text field up here, and it scales down in size. So we're gonna mimic that. So the first thing we're going to do is going to select our label, and we're going to add a move, and we're going to move it to 8. So that's, if we think about our whole text input, this is the boundary, this is the artboard of the input, and our label is currently at 20Y, so we're moving it up to 8. Okay. As we can see, if we tap it, nothing's happening. That's because the label is blocking. It's almost directly over the text input, and it's blocking it. So we need to tell the label to be ignored. So we can do that by going to the bottom. So with the label selected, go to the bottom of the screen and just check this box, make lower layers touchable. That means that it's now going to allow our cursor to, our mouse click to go through the label, and it's going to touch the input field. So let's try that again. There you go. So you can see that the input field is selected, you can see the flashing cursor, and you can see the label just move slightly. Okay, cool. Okay, we're going to scale it as well. So we're going to add a scale. And we're going to scale it by a factor. Scale by. Okay. Okay, let's just test that. Okay, so now we can see our label is scaling down and it's moving to slightly above. But we can see that there's a slight misalignment here where the cursor, I want the cursor to appear directly under the label. And let's check that again, just refresh that. Okay, so the input field, let's just hide this label for a sec. I know why. The input field's probably got some padding on it. Padding, padding, padding. There you are. So let's just remove the padding from the left. Let's have a look at that. Let's actually show the label. Wow, things are a bit funky tonight. Let's preview that. Obviously not getting enough sleep. Working too hard. Need to drink more coffee. Okay, so now it's nicely aligned, which is cool. Now, there's something wrong with this. We've got this red line. We only want this red line to show when it's focused, so we actually need to change the activated line's opacity down to 0, so that's kind of out of the picture. And now we can show it. So we select activated line and add an opacity. Make that 100. That looks good. Looking like a real input field. Awesome. Yeah, we want to kind of deselect it. So we're going to make the background 50% opacity. So slightly lighter, and then we'll bring that up to 100 when it's selected as well. Okay, gives that a bit more emphasis. Okay, it's looking good. Right, so this is all so far pretty straightforward ProtoPie stuff, not really any component stuff specifically going on here. But now we're going to introduce some. So I want to be able to tell my prototype, I want to be able to send a message out to tell my prototype that the input field has focus. So I can then control it from the outside. So the way we do that is we use messages, and there's two kinds of messages. There's a send message and a receive message. So we want to send a message out because we're doing all the interaction inside of this component. We want to send it from inside of the component out into the world, into our scene. So we're going to add a send response, and we're going to send it to parent. And we're going to send it to parent. There's two ways we could do this. We could send to current scene, or we could send to parent. Now, sending to parent is what is called an explicit response. So when I use this component inside of my scene, I'm going to actually select the component instance, and therefore I'll know exactly what that component is. That'll probably make a lot more sense when we get there. But sending to current scene is like sending anonymously, so I won't know where that message has come from specifically if I use send to current scene, and I want to know specifically what input field is sending the message. So that's why I'm using send to parent. And I'm going to send a message, and messages can be anything you want them to be, as long as you understand what they are. This is about matching a message that's sent out to the receive that you're looking for in your scene. So I tend to make all my messages caps, and I'm just going to send the word focus. Okay, So that's our first state created. So we're going to do another focus. We're going to basically duplicate this because this currently works when we tap physically, we tap into the input field. So let's just show that again. So that works when we do that, but I want the ability to be able to pre-select it by default. And you can think about that in apps such as a login, where if you definitely know that the primary action is to fill out the input, then you might want to select that input by default. That's something we call in UX a smart default, and we're going to do that. So to do that, we need to trigger that somehow. So imagine we're in our scene and we've got this component, this kind of like self-contained black box, and we need to kind of send a message in to tell it to do some stuff. So for that, we're going to add a trigger, which is receive. So receive is a trigger, send is a response. Okay, so we're going to add a receive trigger, and we're going to receive a message, and that's going to be focus. And we're going to receive that from the parent. So the parent in most cases will be your scene, but because in ProtoPie you can do nested components, that message could also be, you could also have your inputs inside of another component. So again, using parent enables you to do that, whereas if you set it to current scene, it's always going to look at the scene, no matter how many nested components you have. And we're just going to copy all of these. And we're going to paste them in. Okay, so we're going to test. We've got our first little bit of component stuff to test. So let's save the file actually, because I can see it's untitled. Text put in caps 2. Okay, that's fine. So we can back out into our scene. So we've already got an instance of our component. That's the one we originally created. Let's call this first name. And let's just make some changes. So with components, you've got the concept of overrides like you have in Figma and Sketch. This is probably closer to Figma the way it's implemented. So I can just twizzle down my component and I can see all of the elements inside, and I can affect all of these to a certain degree. I can style them, I can make a whole bunch of changes. So if you just select each layer and have a look down in the properties panel, you'll see what you have control over. You can also just change text values as well. So I'm just double clicking that, and I'm going to put the label first name. Let's just move it up there. Okay, so that's and I can change like the background color. I can change that to like a blue. The activated line, I can change that color. I can change that to a blue. So a whole bunch of stuff that I could do. Let's just undo those. The grey. Okay, so I want to see if this is working. So when this scene loads, I want the input field to be selected by default. Do you want to use the start trigger? Because we're receiving inside of the component. So we do want to send a message to the component. First name, we want to send a message focus. There you go. Okay, let's preview that. Okay, so you can see that it's been selected. Let me just double check. Let's just go into that component and just double check this. So you can see, let's just go back a minute and let's preview that again. So you can see the animations happen, but there's no flashing cursor. That was a bit that was confusing me a little bit, and that's because, excuse me, if we go into our component, we haven't actually told, so this first group is using focus in, but we haven't actually added a focus inside of our receive trigger. So we need to add a focus here as well. Focus input. There we go, that makes sense. Much more sense. Okay, it doesn't really matter what order these things go in. Entirely up to you, because everything gets executed on time, and for all these things they're all pretty independent, so it doesn't really matter what order they happen. They're all happening in a fraction of a second. Let's come back out, let's test. Now we've got our flashing cursor. If we just refresh that, you can see it's selecting by default, and it's selected by default because we've told it to in this start trigger. Okay, so that's the first bit. So let's just turn this off for a minute. So if you ever want to just disable some interactions, you can just select the top one and you can just turn it off, and it'll just turn off the whole thing. We'll just do that, and we'll go back into our component. Right click in the layer. So there's two ways as you can see, because this has got overrides, just double click in the component just goes into one of the instance objects, which is not what I want. So if I actually want to edit the component, I can either right click, go to master component from the component in the layer. I can also select it over here, or I can go into the component list and I can double click in here. All three ways get you to the same place. Okay, 2 down. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to be able to unfocus the input field. So if I select outside, then I want it to unfocus. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do this using another receive trigger. So I can actually control it from my scene. And receive from parent again, and the message this time is going to be unfocus. That's what I'm going to be looking for. And one of the effects we're going to do is I'm going to add a whole bunch of resets here. So there's a really handy, because I'm just reversing the input field back to its original state, I can just use resets. Okay, so visually I've changed the label, I've changed the background color, I've changed the activated line. Those are the things that I want to reset. So let's choose label and add a reset, and let's choose activated line, add a reset, and then finally background, because we changed the tints of it, and a reset. Let's test that. Let's just drag out another instance. Let's call this last name, all in caps. Okay, and we're going to receive a message from a component, which is going to be this case. So actually, let's change this to last name. Okay, back to here. So we're going to choose last name, and we're going to choose a message focus. So what we're basically doing here is, when we select this input field, we want to unfocus the first name input field. Okay. So we've used the receive here to invoke the last name to focus, So when we receive a message, we're going to send another message. So when we receive a message from that component, we're going to send a message to our first component, our first name component, and we're going to tell it to unfocus. Okay. Let's preview that. Okay. So I'm currently here, I'm currently focused, put some value in. Now I'm going to select this second one, and we can see, okay, we've obviously got some things we need to fix, but we can see now that when we selected the second input, the first input has now unfocused. But what you also can see is that it's unfocused, but it's also gone back to its kind of original state, which is when it didn't have a value. And we've now obviously typed a value in, so we actually don't want the label to animate back down when we move from one to the other. So let's go back and fix that. We're going to go back into our component. And we need to look at this unfocus receive set of resets. So the label, we don't want to reset if it's got a value. So we need to add a condition. It's just off the bottom of the screen here. And we're going to move the label into the condition, the reset. And we only want that to run if there's no text value in the input field. So our condition is going to look at the input field, and it's going to look at the input field's text property. And if it equals nothing, no value, so we're not going to put anything in here, if it equals nothing, we're going to reset the label. But if it doesn't equal nothing, i.e. if there's a value in there, it's not going to run this condition. Let's test that out. Fingers crossed. So let's test the first situation where there's nothing in here. So I can just, okay, we need to fix that. That's kind of weird. Oh, because we haven't put a receive there. Actually, let's just do that. Let's just duplicate this and do it the other way around. So first, last. Okay, run this. So we can do this little dance between the two input fields. Okay, they're all deselecting and that's all cool. But let's put a value in. Ooh. That's not the whole, that's the first name's Luke. If my first name's not Luke. So now when I select this, this shouldn't animate. And there you go. So we've now got an input field which has two states, with a value and without a value. Okay, that's looking good. We're getting close to the end. I can feel it. Must be the false. Right, let's go back into our master component. Let's just twizzle these up, make it a little bit easier to see. Okay, so we've got an input field, and it's nicely selected between the two, but we actually want the text that the user's going to type, and at the moment we can't get it because it's inside of our component and we don't have any way of getting it from outside of the component. We need to actually build the functionality inside of the component and actually send the message outward. And we're going to use variables for that. So let's go to our master component. Yeah, so we're going to use a trigger called detect. Now detect is, if you don't know detect, it's a trigger that looks for changes in something, and you can detect changes in lots of things inside of ProtoPie. We're going to detect, in fact, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a variable here. We're going to call it text. and we're going to make it a text variable. Okay, very important step that. Right, so go back to our detect. We're now going to detect when our input, and specifically you can see all the things you can detect. We want to detect when our input text changes. So every time you type a letter, it's changing. And every time it changes, detect is going to detect that. And anything we put inside of this is going to run every time that happens. So what we're going to do is we're going to assign to our text variable, and this is, we're going to add a formula in here, and we want to grab the input. I'm going to hit a dot, and we want the input's text value. Okay, and then we want to send it out of the component to the parent, and we'll put text. Could be anything really. Now here's the important bit. We need to send the value of our variable. Okay. Okay. So let's come back out. Now we need to add a corresponding variable outside to pass the value of the variable that's coming from the inside of the component. So we're going to add another variable. And let's call this first name. Because we've got two instances. Oh, we can't do that. Silly boy. First name camel case. And actually let's add another variable, and we'll call it last name. And these need to be text variables as well. Okay. Okay, so we're going to receive from a component, and the first component we're going to choose is first name, and we want the text message. When we receive that text message, we're going to assign to a variable, and we're going to, this is the first name variable, the value. Okay, and to see if this is working, we're going to, on variables, you've got this little bug on the right hand corner, so this is like a little debug function you've got inside of ProtoPie. So let's just select that. You get this little green box. And this will show us the value that's inside of this variable. And we're going to do the same for last name. And we're going to duplicate this receive trigger. I'm just going to change it to last name, and we're going to assign it to last name. Okay, let's preview that. So I tap inside of here, and I type Luke, and you can see as I'm typing, the variable's being passed from inside of the component out into my scene, and it's been assigned to that variable. And if I now type in my last name, which is obviously this, I can see that that's also being passed to the other variable. Pretty cool, eh? A little bit confusing. Hopefully you kind of got those concepts, and might take a few goes to kind of go back through the video and kind of get it in your head, but I now have a working input in text field component that I can use, but more importantly, I can grab the values and I can use them elsewhere in my prototype. They've now been assigned to these effectively these are global variables. ProtoPie calls them for all scenes and for this scene, but this is really a global variable, and this is a local variable. What we really call them. And I can now, if I save them as global variables, I can use them in any scene. I can pass them to another message to another scene. So there you go, a fully working, fully skinnable input component inside a ProtoPie. Hope that was useful for you. A little bit more advanced, this one, than some of the other stuff I've done, and we're going to be doing some more advanced tutorials in the future. If you've got any questions, then just message me on the video. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. Yeah, I'll hopefully see you next time. Take it easy.